The life you are living right now is not being controlled by what you want. It is being controlled by what you have been programmed to expect. That realization changes everything. Most people spend their days chasing goals they never truly believe they can achieve. They say they want abundance, yet secretly expect limitation. They say they desire success, yet emotionally prepare for disappointment. They dream of freedom, yet continue identifying with the same version of themselves that created their current circumstances. And then they wonder why nothing changes. The greatest prison was never built from steel bars or locked doors. It was built from repeated thoughts, emotional conditioning, and unconscious assumptions that slowly became accepted as truth. What you repeatedly think, feel, and believe eventually forms a mental blueprint. That blueprint becomes your paradigm, and your paradigm quietly governs your results. You may believe you are making conscious decisions throughout the day, but most of your actions are automatic. They arise from patterns embedded deep within your subconscious mind. The subconscious does not question whether a belief is true or false. It simply accepts what has been repeatedly impressed upon it and works tirelessly to make that belief appear real. This is why two people can be presented with the exact same opportunity and produce entirely different outcomes. One sees possibility, the other sees risk. One feels capable, the other feels inadequate. One moves forward while the other hesitates. The difference is not intelligence. The difference is programming. And tonight, as you prepare to sleep, there is something profoundly important for you to understand. The moments before sleep are among the most powerful moments of your entire day. During this transition between wakefulness and sleep, the conscious mind begins to relax its grip. Resistance weakens. Analysis slows. The doorway to the subconscious begins to open. Most people waste this sacred period replaying worries, frustrations, and fears. They unknowingly impress limitation into the very part of the mind responsible for creating their future. Imagine planting seeds in fertile soil every single night. What kind of harvest would you expect if the seeds were fear, doubt, resentment, and scarcity? The subconscious cannot distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a physically lived one. It responds to emotional impressions. It responds to repetition. It responds to belief. This means you possess an extraordinary ability. You can begin consciously planting new seeds before you sleep. You can begin constructing a new self-image. And everything begins with self-image. Your self-image is the hidden mechanism behind every result in your life. It determines what opportunities you notice, what risks you take, what relationships you attract, what income you allow, and what level of success feels normal to you. Most people try to change their circumstances without changing their self-image. They attempt to earn more while continuing to see themselves as someone who struggles. They attempt to become confident while secretly identifying as insecure. They attempt to create abundance while emotionally attached to lack. The subconscious rejects what conflicts with identity. If you see yourself as a certain type of person, your behavior will eventually conform to that image. Change the image, change the life. There was once a woman who worked at a small administrative job. She was hardworking, intelligent, and deeply caring. Yet she lived in constant financial stress. Every month felt like survival. Every bill felt like a threat. What made her situation especially frustrating was that she genuinely wanted more. She read books, she attended seminars, she listened to motivational talks. Yet year after year, nothing changed. Then one day she encountered an idea that stopped her in her tracks. The problem was not her effort. The problem was her identity. For years she had unconsciously viewed herself as someone who struggled financially. It was not merely a circumstance. It had become part of who she believed she was. Without realizing it, she expected struggle. She anticipated limitations. She emotionally identified with scarcity. So she began a simple practice every night before sleep. Instead of replaying financial worries, she imagined herself as the person she wished to become. She visualized making confident decisions. She imagined abundance flowing naturally into her life. She saw herself as valuable, capable, and deserving of greater opportunities. Night after night, she impressed these images upon her subconscious mind. At first, nothing seemed different. Then subtle changes began appearing. Her confidence increased. Her conversations changed. Her standards improved. She started recognizing opportunities she previously ignored. Within 2 years, she had launched a successful consulting business that generated more income than she had ever imagined possible. What changed? Her paradigm changed. Her self-image changed. And when her identity changed, her external reality followed. This is one of the most misunderstood truths about success. Success is not something you pursue. Success is something you align with. The frequency you consistently embody determines what you experience. Every thought carries energy. Every emotion carries energy. Every belief carries energy. You are constantly broadcasting a signal through your dominant mental and emotional state. If your internal world is saturated with fear, doubt, and limitation, that signal influences your decisions, perceptions, and actions. If your internal world is saturated with possibility, confidence, and abundance, that signal begins producing entirely different outcomes. This is not magic, it is law. Your outer world reflects your inner world with astonishing precision. The question is not whether you are creating your future. You are. The question is whether you are creating it consciously or unconsciously. As you relax deeper into this understanding, consider something remarkable. Every great achievement in human history began as an invisible idea. Every innovation, every company, every masterpiece, every movement, every transformation, before it existed physically, it existed mentally. The same principle applies to your life. The person you are becoming already exists as a possibility within you. The confidence you desire exists. The abundance you desire exists. The success you desire exists. The freedom you desire exists. What prevents their expression is not lack of potential. It is attachment to an outdated self-concept. You cannot consistently outperform the image you hold of yourself. But the moment you begin seeing yourself differently, everything begins shifting. Your decisions change. Your habits change. Your expectations change. Your standards change. And eventually your results change. Tonight, release the identity that has kept you small. Release the stories that no longer serve you. Release the limitations you inherited from past experiences, past failures, and past conditioning. Those experiences may have shaped your history, but they do not define your future. You are not confined by what has happened. You are guided by what you choose to believe now. As you drift towards sleep, impress upon your subconscious the image of the person you are becoming. See that version of yourself clearly. Feel the emotions of abundance, confidence, purpose, and gratitude as though they already belong to you, because in truth they do. The future you seek is not waiting somewhere outside of you. It is waiting for recognition within you. The moment your self-image aligns with your highest potential, the invisible barriers begin to dissolve. New possibilities emerge. New opportunities appear. New realities unfold. And you finally realize that the power you spent years searching for was never missing. It was sleeping within you, waiting for the moment you decided to awaken it. If this message resonates with you, subscribe to Proctor Mindset Lab and begin transforming your mind today. And once you begin to understand this, another layer of truth reveals itself, one that most people never stop long enough to examine. You have been taught to focus almost exclusively on what is happening around you. From childhood, your attention has been directed towards circumstances, conditions, and appearances. You learn to evaluate your life by looking at bank accounts, job titles, relationships, achievements, and external validation. Yet the most influential force in your life has always existed beyond the reach of your physical senses. It exists in the realm of thought. Every visible result is preceded by an invisible cause. Every condition you experience today was once a thought repeated often enough to become a belief. Every belief became a lens through which you interpreted reality, and every interpretation influenced your actions, whether you realized it or not. This is why two people can experience the same setback and emerge with completely different futures. One interprets failure as evidence of inadequacy. The other interprets it as feedback. One allows disappointment to define identity. The other uses it to strengthen identity. The event itself is rarely the deciding factor. The meaning attached to the event is what changes everything. Think about how many limitations people carry simply because of conclusions they reached years ago. A business failed, so they concluded they were not capable. A relationship ended, so they concluded they were unworthy. An opportunity was missed, so they concluded success belonged to someone else. The subconscious accepts these conclusions as instructions. Then it goes to work organizing perception around them. Suddenly, evidence appears everywhere. Not because the belief is true, because the mind seeks consistency. The subconscious would rather preserve a familiar identity than create an unfamiliar future, even if that familiar identity creates pain. This explains why people often sabotage opportunities they claim to want. A promotion appears, but they hesitate. A new relationship emerges, but they withdraw. A business opportunity arrives, but they delay. On the surface, it seems irrational. Beneath the surface, it makes perfect sense. The opportunity requires a version of themselves they have not yet accepted, and so they retreat to what feels familiar. Not because familiarity is rewarding, because familiarity feels safe. But growth has never lived inside familiarity. Growth begins the moment you become willing to think beyond the boundaries of your current identity. What would happen if you stopped consulting your past every time you imagined your future? What would happen if yesterday no longer determined tomorrow? What would happen if the version of you that created your current reality was no longer the version making your next decisions? These questions are more powerful than they first appear, because every transformation begins with a new question. The quality of your life is often determined by the quality of the questions you repeatedly ask yourself. Many people ask questions that reinforce limitation. Why does this always happen to me? Why am I unlucky? Why can't I get ahead? Why do others succeed while I struggle? Notice what happens when those questions are asked repeatedly. The mind immediately searches for answers. It gathers evidence. It strengthens the paradigm. Now imagine asking different questions. What abilities have I not fully developed? What opportunities am I overlooking? What would the most confident version of me do next? What belief must I release to move forward? Suddenly, the mind begins searching in a completely different direction. A new pathway starts forming. A new identity starts emerging. A new future becomes possible. This is why awareness is so valuable. You cannot change what remains unconscious. But the moment you become aware of a limiting belief, you are no longer controlled by it in the same way. You can challenge it. You can replace it. You can choose something greater. Many people spend years trying to change behavior while ignoring the beliefs generating that behavior. They focus on surface level adjustments while the underlying paradigm remains untouched. Yet behavior is merely an expression of identity. Change identity, and behavior naturally follows. Consider how effortlessly a person acts in accordance with who they believe they are. Someone who sees themselves as healthy naturally makes different choices than someone who identifies as unhealthy. Someone who sees themselves as valuable naturally communicates differently than someone who doubts their worth. The behavior is not forced, it flows from self-perception. And that is precisely why your nighttime thoughts matter so much. As the conscious mind quiets and the subconscious becomes more receptive, you have an opportunity to rehearse a new identity. Not someday, not when circumstances improve. Now, you can begin feeling abundant before external abundance appears. You can begin feeling confident before external proof arrives. You can begin feeling worthy before anyone else's approval is given. In fact, this sequence is often reversed by those who transform their lives. Most people wait for results before allowing themselves to feel successful. Those who understand success psychology feel successful first. Then the results follow. This is not about pretending. It is about alignment. When your thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and self-image move in the same direction, an extraordinary level of personal power becomes available to you. Internal conflict decreases, clarity increases, decisions become easier, energy becomes focused, and life begins responding differently. There is a frequency associated with certainty. Not arrogance, not ego, certainty. It is the quiet conviction that what you seek is possible because you are capable of becoming the person who can create it. That conviction cannot be borrowed from someone else. It must be cultivated within, and every night presents another opportunity to strengthen it. As you prepare to sleep, imagine releasing every unnecessary burden you carried throughout the day. Release comparison, release self-doubt, release resentment, release fear of judgment. These mental weights consume enormous amounts of creative energy. You were not designed to spend your life defending limitations. You were designed to expand, to evolve, to create, to express potential that has not yet fully emerged. There is far more within you than you have been conditioned to believe. Far more intelligence, far more resilience, far more creativity, far more power. The tragedy is not that people lack potential. The tragedy is that they spend their lives identifying with only a fraction of it. Tonight, allow yourself to consider a possibility that may feel larger than anything you have previously imagined. The life you desire may not require becoming someone completely different. It may simply require removing the mental barriers that have prevented the real you from fully expressing itself. Beneath every limiting belief exists a greater truth. Beneath every fear exists untapped strength. Beneath every doubt exists dormant confidence. And beneath every conditioned identity exists the person you are always capable of becoming. The subconscious is listening. The future is responding. And the image you repeatedly impress upon your mind tonight may become the reality you wake up to tomorrow, next month, or years from now. The process has already begun the moment you choose a new vision of yourself and refuse to surrender it. There is a subtle turning point in every human life where awareness begins to override conditioning. And from that moment forward, nothing remains exactly the same. It rarely arrives with drama or intensity. More often, it appears as a quiet recognition that you are not your thoughts, but the observer of them. And once you see that clearly, something extraordinary begins to shift in how you relate to yourself. Most people live fused with their internal dialogue. They believe every thought that appears, every worry that surfaces, every prediction the mind generates. Yet thoughts are not commands. They are not truths. They are conditioned patterns moving through a mental field that has been shaped by repetition, environment, and emotional experience. When you begin to observe your thoughts instead of becoming them, you create space, and in that space, transformation becomes possible. Because what you can observe, you can change. This is where the subconscious mind reveals both its challenge and its opportunity. It has been silently recording every emotional experience, every repeated idea, every accepted belief since early development. It does not judge whether these recordings are useful. It simply stores them and uses them as reference points for future behavior. But what most people never realize is that the subconscious is not fixed. It is responsive. It is reorganizable. It is continuously updating based on what you consistently impress upon it with emotional intensity and repetition. This is why the final moments before sleep carry such significance. In that state, the analytical filters of the conscious mind begin to dissolve. The nervous system slows. Brainwave activity shifts. The boundary between imagination and acceptance becomes thinner. In this receptive state, whatever you dwell upon with feeling begins to sink deeper than logic can resist. If you fall asleep replaying limitation, you are reinforcing identity. If you fall asleep rehearsing possibility, you are reconstructing identity. The difference may seem subtle, but its consequences are profound over time. Consider how effortlessly children absorb identity messages from their environment. They do not question authority the way adults do. They absorb tone, emotion, repetition, and expectation. In many ways, adults are no different. The only distinction is that adult conditioning is layered with more complexity, more history, and more justification. Yet the mechanism remains unchanged. Repetition becomes belief. Belief becomes identity. Identity becomes reality. This is why awareness alone is not enough. Insight without application remains dormant. Transformation requires consistent mental rehearsal of a new self-image until it becomes more familiar than the old one. And familiarity is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. The mind gravitates toward what it recognizes, even when what it recognizes is not beneficial. This is why people often return to patterns they consciously wish to escape. It is not because they lack intelligence or desire. It is because the subconscious prioritizes familiarity over improvement, until a new identity becomes equally or more familiar than the old one. So the question becomes, how do you recondition familiarity itself? By repetition infused with emotion. Not occasional effort, but consistent alignment, not wishful thinking, but embodied imagination. When you visualize your desired self with emotional clarity, you are not escaping reality, you are training perception. You are instructing the subconscious to recognize a new version of normal. And once something becomes normal internally, it begins to emerge externally. This is where many misunderstand the process. They assume change must begin outside first, that circumstances must shift before identity can. But the order is reversed. Circumstances are the last part of the equation, not the first. The inner world always precedes the outer world. This is not philosophy, it is pattern recognition. Every external result you see around you today originated as an internal sequence of thoughts, emotions, and decisions that aligned long enough to manifest. Even your current habits are not random. They are stabilized thought patterns expressed through behavior. And behavior is simply identity in motion. So when you attempt to change your life without changing your identity, you are essentially trying to alter the expression without altering the source. That is why change often feels temporary for most people. It is applied at the surface level, but not anchored at the subconscious level. True transformation requires identity reconstruction. You must begin to think, feel, and act from the perspective of the person you are becoming, not the person you have been. This does not mean denying your current reality. It means refusing to identify with it as permanent. There is a profound difference between acknowledgement and identification. You can acknowledge where you are without becoming defined by it. And that distinction is where personal power begins to return. As you begin to embody a new identity mentally, you will notice resistance. Old thoughts will surface. Familiar doubts will attempt to reclaim authority. This is not failure. It is simply the echo of an older paradigm attempting to maintain dominance. But repetition weakens old patterns, and consistency strengthens new ones. Over time, what once felt unfamiliar begins to feel natural. What once felt difficult becomes effortless. What once felt impossible becomes expected. This is the quiet mechanics of transformation that most never see because they give up during the early stages when internal conflict is still present. Yet conflict is not a sign to stop. It is a sign that change is occurring. Because two identities cannot occupy the same mental space without tension. One must eventually dominate, and the identity you feed with attention, emotion, and repetition is the one that survives. So as you continue shaping your internal world, become intentional about what you allow to repeat within your mind before sleep. Notice the emotional tone of your final thoughts. Notice whether you are reinforcing expansion or contraction. Notice whether you are rehearsing who you want to become or replaying who you have been. Because in that quiet transition into sleep, you are not just ending your day, you are programming your future. And the mind never stops responding to what it has been consistently instructed to believe. There is something deeply empowering in recognizing that you are not waiting for life to change you. You are actively participating in the construction of what comes next. Even when external circumstances appear fixed, the internal environment remains fully within your influence. That is where freedom begins. Not in controlling everything around you, but in mastering the world within you. And as this understanding settles deeper, you begin to see that every night is not simply rest, it is recalibration. It is a return to the subconscious workshop where identity is continuously being refined. The question is whether you are entering that workshop consciously or unconsciously. Because either way, construction is happening. The only difference is whether you are directing it. And once you fully accept that your mind is always shaping your life, you stop treating thoughts as random noise and begin treating them as creative instructions. In that realization, responsibility becomes power. And power, when understood correctly, becomes the ability to choose your next version of yourself with intention, not someday, not when conditions improve, but in the quiet moments when no one is watching, when the world is silent, and when the subconscious is most receptive to the identity you are willing to embody next. That is where change becomes inevitable. Not because life forces it, but because you finally align with it from within. There comes a point in deep inner transformation where motivation is no longer the driving force, because motivation is unstable by nature. It rises and falls with emotion, circumstance, and external stimulation. What replaces it is something far more powerful and far more consistent: identity-driven certainty. When you begin to operate from identity rather than impulse, you stop negotiating with your higher vision. You stop asking whether you feel like doing what is required, and you begin embodying the person for whom those actions are natural. This shift is subtle at first, almost imperceptible, yet it changes everything about how you move through your life. Because now, discipline is no longer a struggle. It becomes alignment, and alignment always feels lighter than resistance. Most people misunderstand discipline as force. They believe it requires pushing against themselves, overriding hesitation, suppressing doubt. But true discipline is not force, it is coherence. It is the absence of internal contradiction. When your self-image and your desired future are misaligned, every action feels heavy. Every decision feels like effort. Every attempt feels like strain. But when identity begins to match vision, action becomes expression rather than obligation. You are no longer trying to become someone. You are allowing someone to emerge through you. This is the deeper psychology behind all lasting change. It is not about adding more effort to your life. It is about removing the internal conflict that drains your energy and fragments your focus. Think about how much of your daily struggle comes not from external challenges, but from internal disagreement. One part of you wants growth, while another part clings to familiarity. One part desires expansion, while another fears exposure. One part reaches forward, while another pulls back. That tension consumes enormous mental energy, and yet most people never question it. They assume this inner conflict is normal, even permanent. But it is not. It is simply the result of multiple competing identities operating within the same mind. Transformation begins when one identity becomes dominant, not through suppression, but through reinforcement. The identity you consistently rehearse becomes the identity that leads. This is why your imagination is not a passive faculty, it is a training ground. Every mental image you allow yourself to dwell upon is shaping emotional expectation. And emotional expectation is what the subconscious uses to predict and construct behavior. When you imagine failure repeatedly, you are not being realistic. You are rehearsing familiarity with limitation. When you imagine success repeatedly, you are not being delusional. You are rehearsing familiarity with possibility. The subconscious does not evaluate imagination in terms of truth. It evaluates it in terms of repetition and emotional charge. Whatever is repeated with feeling becomes increasingly natural for the mind to accept as identity. And once something is accepted as identity, the body begins to obey it. This is where change becomes physical. Your posture shifts, your tone shifts, your decisions shift, your standards shift, and gradually, your external world begins to reorganize around your new internal assumption of self. But this process requires patience that most people underestimate. Because the old identity does not disappear immediately. It lingers as memory, as habit, as emotional residue. It attempts to reassert itself through familiar thoughts and automatic reactions. This is where many people mistakenly conclude that change is not working. They assume that because old patterns still appear, nothing is shifting. But awareness of old patterns is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of exposure. You cannot transform what you cannot see. And once something becomes visible, it becomes editable. The key is not to fight the old identity. It is to starve it of attention and to feed the new one consistently, even in small ways, especially in small ways. Because identity is not changed through dramatic moments alone. It is reshaped through repetition in ordinary moments. The way you speak to yourself when no one is listening, the way you interpret setbacks when no one is watching, the way you respond internally to everyday choices that seem insignificant. These are the moments where transformation either strengthens or weakens, not in public performance, but in private alignment. And as this alignment deepens, something remarkable begins to happen. You start to experience life differently, even before external results fully catch up. Your emotional baseline shifts, your tolerance for negativity decreases, your expectations quietly rise, your sense of possibility expands without effort. You are no longer convincing yourself of change, you are embodying it. And embodiment is always more powerful than affirmation alone. Affirmations without identity are noise. Affirmations anchored in identity become instruction. This is why repetition before sleep is so influential. Because in that state, the subconscious is not analyzing your words. It is absorbing the emotional essence behind them. It is registering who you believe yourself to be at the deepest level. And that belief becomes the blueprint for tomorrow's behavior. Now imagine applying this understanding consistently for weeks, months, years. Imagine the cumulative effect of thousands of nights where your final thoughts are aligned with expansion rather than limitation, where your emotional state before sleep reflects possibility rather than fear, where your mental imagery consistently rehearses the life you are choosing to inhabit. Over time, the gap between imagination and reality begins to close, not because reality suddenly changes, but because you do. There is a moment in every transformation where you realize you are no longer trying to become someone new. You are remembering a version of yourself that was always available but previously unexpressed. This realization brings a quiet confidence, not loud or performative, but grounded. It is the kind of certainty that does not require external validation because it is internally anchored. And from that state, decision-making becomes different. You no longer ask, "Can I do this?" You begin to ask, "Does this align with who I am becoming?" That single shift changes the trajectory of your entire life, because every decision is now filtered through identity instead of fear. Every action becomes a reinforcement instead of a contradiction. Every choice becomes either a step into expansion or a step back into limitation, and you become far more aware of which direction you are moving. Not perfectly, but consciously. And consciousness is the beginning of freedom. As you continue to deepen this awareness, you may notice something else emerging, a growing distance from old narratives. The stories you once told about yourself begin to feel less absolute. They start to lose emotional authority. They no longer define you in the same way. This is not denial of your past. It is liberation from its dominance. Your past may explain you, but it does not determine you. And once that distinction becomes emotionally real, not just intellectually understood, something powerful shifts. You begin to interact with your future as something editable rather than fixed. You begin to live forward instead of backward. And in that orientation, life begins to open in ways that were previously invisible. Opportunities were always there, but now you are perceptive enough to recognize them. Possibilities were always available, but now you are aligned enough to act on them. And potential was always within you, but now you are structured enough internally to express it. This is the quiet architecture of success that no one can see from the outside. It is not built in sudden leaps. It is built in internal recalibration, in repeated mental alignment, in subtle identity reinforcement that compounds over time, until one day you look at your life and realize it no longer matches the limitations you once believed in. And that realization is not surprising. It is inevitable.
What we have been exploring is not theory in the abstract sense. It is a description of how a human life is actually being directed from the inside out. Once you understand this, you stop seeing success as something you chase and start seeing it as something that naturally unfolds from a specific inner structure. Most people think their life is being controlled by external conditions: money, opportunities, timing, education, and other people's decisions. But those are only effects. The cause is always internal, and the internal mechanism that quietly runs everything is the subconscious mind working through a paradigm. A paradigm is simply a mental program. It is a collection of habits, beliefs, and automatic emotional responses that you have accepted over time. You didn't choose most of it consciously. It was formed through repetition, emotional experiences, and environment, especially in early life. And once a paradigm is formed, it begins to operate like an invisible autopilot. That autopilot determines what you think is possible for you, not what is actually possible, what feels possible. And that distinction is where most people's limitations begin. For example, imagine someone who grew up in an environment where money was always a source of stress. Bills were discussed with anxiety, rich people were criticized, Money was associated with struggle, even if nobody explicitly said you will struggle financially. The emotional atmosphere communicated it clearly. That person may grow up wanting financial success, but subconsciously they carry an emotional blueprint that says money equals stress. So even when opportunities appear, they may hesitate, self-sabotage, or unconsciously choose paths that feel familiar rather than abundant, not because they lack intelligence, but because their paradigm is organizing their behavior. The subconscious mind does not argue. It accepts what is repeatedly impressed upon it, especially when emotion is involved. This is why repetition is so powerful. Repetition without emotion is weak. Repetition with emotion becomes programming. If you repeatedly think, "I'm not good with money," and feel frustration or defeat while thinking it, the subconscious records it as truth. Over time, that becomes your identity, and identity is the key point most people miss. You do not get what you want in life. You get what you are. Your self-image is the center of your identity. It is the mental picture you hold of yourself, and every decision you make is filtered through that picture. If your self-image is of someone who is not confident, you will unconsciously avoid situations that require confidence. If your self-image is of someone who struggles financially, you will unconsciously make choices that reflect that expectation. This is why change often feels difficult at the beginning. People try to change their results without changing the internal image that is producing those results. It is like trying to print a different document while keeping the same file. The output must match the source. So the real question becomes, how do we change the source? We begin with awareness. You cannot change what you are not aware of. Most people move through life on autopilot, reacting to thoughts without observing them. The first step is to begin noticing patterns without judgment. Noticing is powerful because it creates separation between you and the pattern. For example, you might notice a thought like, "I never have enough money." Instead of accepting it or fighting it, you simply observe it. That observation alone begins weakening its authority. Then you start connecting patterns. When do these thoughts appear? After certain triggers? After comparing yourself to others? After paying bills? You begin to see that these are not truths, they are conditioned responses. Once you see the pattern clearly, you are no longer fully controlled by it. The next step is interruption. You cannot simply remove a belief, you replace it. If a limiting thought appears consistently, you consciously introduce a new interpretation, not in a forced or artificial way, but in a deliberate and repeated way. Instead of "I am bad with money," you begin practicing thoughts like, "I am learning how to manage money effectively." At first, it may not feel fully believable. That is normal. You are not trying to convince your current identity. You are building a new one. Beliefs are not formed by one powerful thought. They are formed by repeated thoughts accepted over time. Emotion accelerates this process. This is why simply repeating affirmations without feeling does very little. The subconscious responds to emotional intensity, so when you introduce a new thought, you also try to feel the direction of it, not forcing belief, but imagining what it would feel like if it were becoming true. Over time, repetition with emotional alignment begins to shift the internal blueprint. But mindset work alone is not enough if it stays in imagination. It must be anchored in behavior. This is where identity transformation becomes practical. If you want to change your self-image, you do not start by waiting for confidence to appear. You start by acting in small ways that are consistent with the identity you are building. For example, if you want to become someone financially responsible, you might begin by tracking small expenses consciously, not because the act itself is life-changing, but because it reinforces identity alignment. You are sending a message to your subconscious, "This is who I am becoming." If you want to become more confident, you do not wait until fear disappears. You practice speaking up in small situations. You hold eye contact a little longer. You express opinions more clearly. These small actions accumulate identity evidence. The subconscious learns through evidence, not intention. Every action you take either reinforces your old identity or builds a new one. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. A single intense effort does not reprogram the subconscious. Repeated alignment does. There is also a deeper principle at work here. The mind always seeks consistency. Once you begin introducing new patterns consistently, the subconscious will eventually adjust to reduce internal conflict. It will begin to reorganize your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors to match your new direction. At first, there may be resistance. Old habits will try to return. Old thoughts will feel familiar. This is not failure. It is simply the old paradigm trying to maintain dominance. But if you continue consistently, the new pattern becomes more familiar than the old one, and familiarity determines behavior. Eventually, what once required effort begins to feel natural. That is when true change has occurred. So the practical path is simple, but not always easy. First, you become aware of limiting patterns without judgment. Second, you consciously introduce new thoughts and perspectives repeatedly, especially when emotion is present. Third, you align your daily actions with the identity you are building, even in small ways. Over time, these 3 steps begin to reshape your paradigm. And when your paradigm shifts, your results must follow. Not immediately, but inevitably, because your outer world is always a reflection of your inner programming. If you change the program, you change the projection. And when you understand this deeply, you stop waiting for life to change you. You begin participating in your own transformation with clarity and intention.